For instance, there are those who are willing to engage in a peace process. They have been criticized for sending Jews to the gas ovens again. Those who criticize the state have been accused of making the Jews vulnerable to another Holocaust. But it happens in different contexts as well. It happens by Israelis against Israelis, by critics of Israel against Israelis, by Israelis against Jews in the diaspora, and those who are critical of Israel very often or sometimes lapse into the equation of Israel with the Nazis, right? Israeli soldiers with the Nazis. So you have the right-wing settlers calling Israeli soldiers Nazis, but you also have left-wing anti-Zionists calling Israeli soldiers Nazis. It's a beautiful world we're living in. Tom Powell, who's a left British journalist, refers time and again to the so-called Zionist SS, without apology. And I think the lay arguments that claim that if the Israeli state now traumatically mimics the Nazi regime are regularly circulated on listservs that are critical of Israel. I try sometimes to stay on those listservs, and sometimes I'm unable to stay on them. It would seem that those who defend the state and those who oppose it, or at least some of its policies and practices, are both subject to the accusation of being Nazis in different ways. So it's important to ask what kind of circulating discourse this is that is so easily brought to bear against supporters and detractors of Israel alike. Brought to bear sometimes by Israelis themselves and sometimes by those outside of Israel. Clearly, the worst possible accusation for any Jew is to be called a Nazi. If you are called a Nazi, the accusation works to literally paralyze you to the point where you can no longer speak. Okay, it is a kind of social death, right? It puts an end to conversation, but it's also a way of passing on, I would say, a traumatic effect and instrumentalizing this traumatic effect for the purposes of rendering someone else's political position unacceptable, untenable, beyond repair. The invocation of this accusation in the context of the evacuation of Gaza last year was in some ways quite predictable. Although some of the Israelis evacuated used the language of the Holocaust, the Shoah, arguing not only that they were being dispossessed and destroyed, and not just they were being destroyed, but all of the Jewish people were being destroyed, but that all Jews were threatened by this act all over the world. For the record, it might be interesting to know that at the time there were approximately 8,000 Israelis who were compelled to leave their homes in 2004 and 5, and there had been, during, at least since 2000, 1,719 Palestinians killed in Gaza. There were another 9,000 Palestinians injured there. There were 2,704 Palestinian homes razed, displacing 20,000 Palestinians. Okay, so that's just to give you a kind of lay of the land. And I don't want to set this up to talk about equivalence or non-equivalence, but I want the picture to be widened so we can understand something about the distribution of human suffering in that region. There are many graphic instances of how this works, and I won't dwell on all of them here clearly, but I want to make a further point. That if Primo Levi is right, that the story of the Shoah can grow at the expense of the memory of suffering, the story of the Holocaust can also grow at the expense of apprehending human suffering. In this case, where the plight of the Israelis evacuated from Gaza covered over and deflected from the physical sufferings and political oppression of the 1,300,000 who live there without citizenship, with radically restricted means of making a living and rights of mobility, and an average living wage of something like $2 a day. If the story and image of the Holocaust lays claim to the most unimaginable suffering, then the story and image can work precisely to demean any other suffering or to rename any other act of aggression as an extension and reiteration of the Holocaust itself. Consider, for instance, the relatively simple claim made by Ilan Papa, no friend of mine, but he teaches at Haifa. He claims that he'd like to live in a secular state, and he claims that he would like to live in a state that doesn't discriminate on the basis of religion, ethnicity, or race. Even calls himself a humanist, calls himself a liberal, and in response, he's been told by several people publicly that he is plotting the destruction of the Israeli state. Okay, so with the word destruction of the Israeli state, you get the notion of the destruction of the Jewish people again. So in other words, to take up a position of classical liberalism, say, is tantamount to a Holocaustal act. The overtones carried by destruction are clear, and here again the resonance of the Holocaust has become mundane in arguments of this kind. Now, of course, the problem is when those kinds of resonances become mundane, what happens to our ability to actually make reference to the Holocaust, the Shoah, and to actually understand its importance and even understand the kind of anti-Semitism that continues to be resurgent in relationship to that particular event, as we see, for instance, in recent Iranian slogans, which not only, as Slavoj pointed out yesterday, deny the Holocaust, or if they don't deny it, say they'll finish the job. Of course, one of the problems that results from this, and one of the problems that aids and abets this particular strategy of political aggrandizement, is that political critics of Israel can and do debunk the claim of the Holocaust altogether, right? So if you go on some of the listservs that I'm on, you can find people saying things like, I don't want to hear about the Holocaust anymore. The Holocaust is nothing but an excuse for military aggression. It's nothing but an instrument for Israeli state power. It's nothing but an ideological smokescreen and an emotionally laden way of stigmatizing opposition. At which point, we're in a perilous, I would say, we're in a perilous discursive situation. On the other hand, there are those who react to this critique by sacralizing or sanctifying the Holocaust to such a degree that it comes to authorize every possible aggression in the name of self-defense. We were exterminated then, we will never be exterminated against. Any act against us will meet with swift, effective, full, aggressive reaction. If the enemy is always, in some sense, the resurgent figure of the Nazi, and if the internal enemy is the self-hating Jew who has become somehow a collaborator through his or her critique of Israel, then this purifies one's own position of every aggression and situates one's own support for violent action as a fully warranted battle against a countervailing evil. If those who sacralize the Holocaust exploit the memory to establish a kind of victimization that can rationalize every one of its aggressions, and if those who deny or demean the Holocaust, or those who claim that the Israeli Defense Forces are now the SS, engage in a cynicism that exploits the Holocaust for the purposes of exposing the conditions of Palestinians, then invoking the Holocaust in either instance becomes a form of hate speech that reanimates the moral horror of the Holocaust at the expense of memory itself, and at the expense of any reflection on what kind of ethical and political framework might usefully be derived from the Holocaust, the Shoah, for the present. And I'll tell you why I move between those two words later. It's a long story. This phenomenon is not exactly new. The discursive circulation of the Holocaust for politically strategic reasons has been there for the start. If I understand her correctly, Jacqueline Rose argues that the Holocaust becomes, for a certain messianic Zionism, the modern exemplar of the catastrophe that is bound to occur, and without which the messianic strain in Judaism cannot renew itself. In other words, the Holocaust must be renewed within contemporary politics in order to reinvigorate the messianic goal of collecting and authorizing the Jewish people as a nation. In effect, for Rose, there could be no renewal of the messianic aims of Zionism without an ongoing and recurrent catastrophe. Now, I actually think that she has a very narrow idea of messianism, and I disagree with it, but that's something we can talk about later. Edith Zertal points to a relative repression of references to the Holocaust within Israeli politics immediately after its founding, suggesting that there was shame about the victimization of the Jews for which the nation of Israel sought to compensate. And she gives kind of some very interesting descriptions about the sort of new masculinities that emerged in the late 40s and early 50s as a way of countering the notion of the suffering Jew. Israeli aggressivity sought to counter that shame in her account and to build a story of the Holocaust that would help to rationalize claims to Jewish sovereignty, Israel's war upon its neighbors, and its occupation of Palestinian lands. Zertal points to some key historical moments in which the discourse on the Holocaust was constructed. The Eichmann trials, and hence the suppression of Hannah Arendt's perspective on the Eichmann trials, indeed the suppression of all of Hannah Arendt's writings on Israel,